Matter in motion. Section 3. Friction, a force that opposes motion. Key concept. Friction is a force that can balance other forces to prevent motion. Friction is also a force that, when unbalanced, can change the velocity of an object. While playing ball, your friend throws the ball out of your reach. Rather than running after the ball, you walk after it. You know that the ball will slow down and stop. An unbalanced force is needed to change the velocity of objects. So, what force is stopping the ball? The ball is stopped by friction. Friction is a force that opposes motion between two surfaces that are touching. Friction can cause a moving object to slow down and stop. The source of friction. The surface of any object is rough. Even surfaces that feel smooth are covered with microscopic hills and valleys. When two surfaces are touching, the hills and valleys of one surface stick to the hills and valleys of the other surface, as shown in Figure 1. This contact causes friction. The magnitude of friction between two surfaces depends on many factors. One factor is the force pushing the surfaces together. Another factor is the materials that make up the surfaces. The effect of force on friction. If the force pushing surfaces together increases, the hills and valleys of the surfaces come into closer contact. This close contact increases the friction between the surfaces. Objects that weigh less exert less downward force than objects that weigh more do, as Figure 2 shows. But the amount of surface touching another surface does not affect the amount of friction. The effect of material on friction. The material that makes up a surface affects the magnitude of friction. For example, friction is usually greater between materials that have rough surfaces than it is between materials that have smooth surfaces. A table tennis ball rolling on carpet slows down and stops because of friction between the ball and the carpet. The amount of friction is large because the carpet has a rough surface. But a table tennis ball rolling on a wood floor rolls for a long time before stopping. The ball keeps rolling because the wood floor has a smooth surface. So, the amount of friction between the ball and the floor is small. Types of friction. There are two types of friction. The friction observed when you slide books across a tabletop is kinetic friction. The other type of friction is static friction. You observe static friction when you push on a piece of furniture that you cannot move. Kinetic friction. The word kinetic means moving. So, kinetic friction is friction between moving surfaces. The amount of kinetic friction between two surfaces depends in part on how the surfaces move. Surfaces can slide past each other, or a surface can roll over another surface. Often, the force of sliding kinetic friction is greater than the force of rolling kinetic friction. Thus, things on wheels are often easier to move than things that must be slid along the floor, as Figure 3 shows. Kinetic friction is very useful in everyday life. You use sliding kinetic friction when you apply the brakes on a bicycle and when you write with a pencil. Rolling kinetic friction is an important part of almost all means of transportation. Anything that has wheels, bicycles, inline skates, cars, trains, and planes, uses rolling kinetic friction. Kinetic friction is often an unbalanced force acting on moving objects. Thus, kinetic friction often changes the velocity of a moving object by slowing down the object. Static friction. Often, a force is applied to an object but does not cause the object to move. The object does not move because the force of static friction is balancing the force applied. Static friction can be overcome by applying a large enough force. As soon as an object starts moving, static friction has gone and has been replaced by kinetic friction. Look at Figure 4 to understand when static friction affects an object. The middle image in Figure 4 shows that the force of static friction is equal in magnitude but opposite in direction to the force applied. So, the forces on the object shown are balanced, and the motion of the object does not change. In fact, some static objects do not move because the force of static friction balances the other forces acting on the object. For example, a ladder leaning against a wall does not move because of static friction between the ladder and the wall, and between the ladder and the ground. Friction, harmful and helpful. Friction is both harmful and helpful to you and to the world around you. Friction can cause holes in your socks. Friction by wind and water can cause erosion. On the other hand, friction between your pencil and your paper is needed for the pencil to leave a mark. Without friction, you would slip and fall when you tried to walk. Because friction can be both harmful and helpful, sometimes it should be decreased and sometimes it should be increased. Ways to reduce friction. Using lubricants is one way to reduce friction. Lubricants are substances that are put on surfaces to reduce the friction between the surfaces. Some examples of lubricants are motor oil, wax, and grease. Lubricants are usually liquids, but they can be solids or gases. An example of a gas lubricant is the air that comes out of the tiny holes on an air hockey table. Figure 5 shows one use of a lubricant. Friction can also be reduced by switching from sliding kinetic friction to rolling kinetic friction. Ball bearings placed between the wheels and axles of inline skates and bicycles make the wheels turn more easily by reducing friction. Another way to reduce the magnitude of friction is to smooth surfaces that rub against each other. For example, rough wood on a park bench can snag your clothes or scratch your skin because there is a large amount of friction between you and the bench. Rubbing the bench with sandpaper makes the bench smoother. As a result, the friction between you and the bench is less. So, the bench will no longer snag your clothes or scratch you. Ways to increase friction. One way to increase friction is to make surfaces rougher. For example, sand spread on icy roads keeps cars from sliding. Baseball players often wear textured batting gloves to increase the friction between their hands and the bat. The increased friction helps stop the bat from flying out of their hands. Another way to increase friction is to increase the force pushing surfaces together. Suppose that you are sanding a piece of wood. You can sand the wood faster by pressing harder on the sandpaper. Pressing harder increases the force pushing the sandpaper and wood together. So, the friction between the sandpaper and wood increases. Figure 6 shows another example of pushing on something to increase friction. Congratulations!